Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more epic tales every day. Liking this video helps us bring you more incredible stories, so smash that like button if you're ready for more. What would you do if you were in this situation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Which part of this story surprised you the most? Share your reactions in the comments. I love reading what you think. If you could add one twist to this story, what would it be? Let's get creative in the comments. What do you think happens next in the human versus alien saga? Let's discuss your theories below. The human soldier's ship hurtled through the void, smoke trailing behind as it plummeted toward the surface of the alien planet below. Inside, alarms screamed, red lights flashing in rhythmic bursts. His hands gripped the controls, trying in vain to steady the descent. The ground rushed up with terrifying speed. Then impact. Everything went black for a moment. He awoke with a sharp gasp, the wind knocked from his chest as he crawled from the wreckage. The landscape before him was a wasteland. Rolling dunes stretched endlessly, the air dry and hot, the sky a pale, cloudless blue. His body ached all over, cuts and bruises decorating his skin, his breathing shallow. Sand whipped around his face as he stood, the oppressive heat bearing down on him, forcing every movement to be slow and deliberate. His head throbbed. He wasn't sure how long he had been unconscious. He checked his communicator, but it was dead. No signal, no backup, no help. He was alone, a speck of human life in an alien desert that seemed to stretch forever. Step after laborious step, he pushed forward, his boots sinking into the soft sand with every stride. He had no idea where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay near the wreckage. There was something hauntingly silent about the desert. No sound except for the faint hiss of wind against the dunes. No sign of life. Hours passed, or maybe days, it was hard to tell. His throat burned with thirst, his mind foggy from dehydration. Just when his strength began to falter completely, he spotted movement in the distance. Shapes, large and looming, moving slowly in the desert haze. He stumbled toward them, his vision blurring. At first, he thought it might be a mirage, some cruel trick of his mind. But as he neared, the figures became clearer, real. There were 6 of them. Alien women, towering over him, shackled in chains, their bodies adorned with intricate armor that shimmered under the harsh desert sun. Their faces were sharp and fierce, framed by elaborate headdresses. They radiated power, but their movements were slow, weighed down by their bindings. The humans stopped a few meters away, staring up at them. For a moment neither side spoke, a quiet tension hanging in the air. These women, clearly warriors of some kind, were imprisoned, their wrists and ankles bound by heavy chains that tethered them together. They were being guarded by strange, bulky creatures, alien enforcers, armored and imposing. The guards glanced at the human and then dismissed him, seemingly unconcerned by his presence. He took a hesitant step forward, his voice hoarse from thirst. "Are you prisoners?" The tallest of the alien women glanced down at him, her eyes narrowing. Her voice was sharp, filled with disdain. "You? A mere human? What do you think you can do?" She gestured to the wreckage of his ship, barely visible in the distance. "You can't even save yourself." The others laughed, a low, mocking sound that cut through the silence of the desert. Their laughter wasn't cruel, but it was dismissive, as if they found the idea of him, small, fragile, human, offering help to be utterly ridiculous. He swallowed, his mouth dry. "I can help. I'll find a way to free you." The same woman, clearly the leader, scoffed. "Free us? You? Look at you." She took in his torn uniform, his sunburned skin, the dried blood on his forehead. "Do you even know who we are? We are goddesses, revered across galaxies. We once commanded armies, toppled empires. And now? We are bound by forces far beyond your comprehension. A human has nothing to offer us." He didn't flinch under her gaze, though her words stung. "I'm not giving up on you. I don't care who you are or what power you've lost. I'll find a way." Another of the alien women, her skin a striking shade of blue, stepped forward, her chains clinking softly. She looked him up and down, as though sizing him up. He's not serious, is he? A human against the warlord's forces? What could he possibly do? The human clenched his fists, ignoring the fatigue dragging him down. I don't need power to help. I just need a plan. The tallest one's laughter faded, and she regarded him with a flicker of curiosity, though her voice remained sharp. And what plan do you have? You've been here mere hours. We've been prisoners for decades. He didn't have a plan yet. But he wouldn't admit that. Plans come with time. With patience. You might be prisoners now, but there's always a way out. I'll find it. The other goddesses exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from amusement to faint irritation. It was clear they didn't take him seriously. They were warriors, once powerful beings, now reduced to captivity. And here was a lone human, barely alive, offering salvation. It must have seemed absurd to them. One of the guards, a hulking creature with gleaming armor and unreadable eyes, glanced toward them, its presence a silent reminder of their captivity. The goddesses fell silent, their mocking smiles fading. For all their power, they were still bound, their once great abilities suppressed, their glory days long behind them. The human knew they thought little of him. He was just a man, after all, one among billions in the vastness of the galaxy. But he couldn't stand by and do nothing. He couldn't walk away. Not while there was still a chance to help, however slim it seemed. I'll be back, he said quietly, turning away from the group. The tallest goddess called after him, her tone half amused, half scornful. And what will you bring, human? What could you possibly offer that the warlord hasn't already taken from us? He didn't respond. His mind was already racing, thinking of possibilities, of how he could turn the odds in their favor. He was bruised, broken, and utterly alone in an unforgiving alien desert. But something deep inside him, something stubborn and unyielding, refused to let him give up. As he walked away, the goddesses continued to watch him, their expressions inscrutable. They saw only weakness in him now, only the fragility of a human lost in a dangerous world. But he would prove them wrong. He had to. In the silence of the desert, his footsteps faded into the distance, leaving behind only the faint sound of wind over the dunes and the quiet clinking of chains. The human soldier was persistent. Despite the harsh words and disdainful laughter of the goddesses, he refused to be discouraged. Every night, while they slept under the guard's watchful eyes, he observed. The warlord's forces had patterns, routines, weaknesses, details they didn't think to hide, assuming no one would dare oppose them. The human, resourceful as ever, committed every small detail to memory. His thoughts were constantly at work, formulating a plan, a way to turn the tide against their captors. The goddesses noticed his movements, though they did little more than roll their eyes at his efforts. Even as their chains weighed heavily on them, they mocked him for his ambition. "What are you planning, human?" one of them would say with a laugh. "Going to single-handedly bring down an entire army?" The human didn't respond to their taunts. He kept his head down, thinking of ways to sabotage their captors, to carve out the smallest of victories. The goddesses watched with a mixture of amusement and skepticism. They had long since given up on hope, after all. How could they believe that someone as insignificant as him could make a difference? But then, the small victories began. It started with something almost imperceptible. A supply crate went missing, a patrol was delayed. At first, the goddesses dismissed it as coincidence. Surely, one human could not have caused such disruptions. But then more things started to happen. Weapons caches were raided. Supplies were damaged. The guards began to speak in hushed tones of a saboteur, a shadow in the desert who evaded them at every turn. The goddesses, still bound in their chains, began to glance at the human with something other than amusement. It was faint, but there was a flicker of something else. Curiosity, perhaps. A tiny ember of respect, though they were far from admitting it. One night the human returned from one of his expeditions, his clothes covered in dust, his face smeared with dirt. He had scavenged a small stash of weapons, enough to arm himself and the goddesses, if they ever got the chance to fight back. He laid them down in the sand, his movements quiet and deliberate. The tallest of the goddesses, the one who had mocked him the most, tilted her head, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the stolen goods. "You did this?" He nodded, his face stoic. "It's a start." She scoffed, but there was less venom in it than before. "A start? Against the warlord's entire army?" He met her gaze, his voice steady. "Every rebellion starts small." The goddesses exchanged glances. They were warriors once, legends among their people. And yet, here they were, dependent on a human, a species they had dismissed as weak, as unworthy of their notice. The irony was not lost on them, but they couldn't deny the results. The human had done more in a few days than they had managed in decades of captivity. Still, their pride kept them from admitting it openly. Despite their dismissive tones, they began to assist him. In small ways, at first. One of them would offer a piece of information about the warlord's routines, a detail that only someone who had been held captive for so long could know. Another would point out a guard's vulnerability, a weak spot in their armor. It was subtle, and they never spoke of it directly, but their cooperation was there, growing, even if begrudgingly. They still taunted him, of course. Old habits died hard. "You think this will work?" one of them said as they watched him plan another sabotage mission. "You're still just one man." He didn't let their words faze him. "Sometimes one is enough." As the days passed, something else began to shift. The goddesses, once so proud, so untouchable, started to reveal the cracks beneath their hardened exteriors. It wasn't intentional, but in the quiet moments between planning and sabotage, they let slip bits and pieces of their own struggles. The tallest one, the one who had led the mocking chorus, sat alone one evening, her eyes distant. The human, after a long day of scavenging and plotting, sat down nearby. They didn't speak at first, the silence stretching between them, thick with the weight of things unsaid. Then, unexpectedly, she spoke. "We were worshipped once. In our world we were goddesses. Untouchable. Unbreakable." The human didn't interrupt, sensing the fragility beneath her words. She continued, her voice softer now, almost sad. "And now we're nothing. Chained. Powerless. What are we without our strength?" He glanced at her, the lines of exhaustion visible on her face, her pride still there but faded. "You're more than your strength." She let out a bitter laugh. "That's easy for you to say. Your kind never had the power we did. You don't know what it's like to lose it." He nodded slowly, understanding her pain but knowing his words wouldn't erase it. "Maybe. But we still know how to fight." She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. Not as a human, weak and insignificant, but as something else. Someone who, despite everything, kept moving forward. Someone who, though physically weaker, had a will that refused to break. There was a long pause before she spoke again. "Why do you care? Why not just leave us? You could find a way off this planet. Save yourself?" He met her gaze, his eyes steady. "Because leaving you behind isn't saving anyone." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. The goddesses, once so certain of their superiority, found themselves reevaluating everything they had once believed. This human, this fragile creature, was doing more than just surviving, he was fighting. And for the first time in a long time, they felt something stir within themselves. A memory of who they once were. Warriors, not victims. In the days that followed, the dynamic between them continued to shift. The goddesses, once so distant, began to speak more freely, sharing their frustrations, their grief over what they had lost. The human listened, never judging, always offering quiet words of encouragement when they needed it most. It was a strange bond, forged in the fires of survival, but it was real. The goddesses might never fully admit it, but they had begun to respect the human. Not for his strength, but for his heart, for his refusal to give up, even when the odds were stacked so high against him. They weren't ready to call him a leader. Not yet. But they followed him, helped him in ways they had once scoffed at. And slowly, ever so slowly, the ember of rebellion began to grow into a flame. For the first time in decades, the goddesses began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could be free again. And it wasn't their lost power that would save them. It was something much more human. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the desert, when the human and the goddesses were discovered. The warlords' enforcers moved swiftly, their silhouettes cutting through the twilight, weapons gleaming in the fading light. There was no time for retreat, no place to hide. The battalion of enforcers, far larger than anything the human had expected, was closing in fast. He turned to the goddesses, their expressions hardening as they realized what was happening. They may have mocked him before, but now, with danger bearing down, they understood the gravity of their situation. They had no choice but to stand and fight. Outnumbered and outgunned, they had nothing but a handful of weapons the human had scavenged and the remnants of their own dormant power. The enforcers advanced, confident in their numbers and technology. The human's mind raced. He knew they wouldn't win a direct fight. Strength was not their advantage. But he also knew that strategy and heart could turn the tide, even in impossible situations. He crouched low, eyes scanning the terrain for anything they could use. The goddesses, while still bound by their chains, began to feel a faint stir of their old selves, a flicker of power long suppressed. They moved into position beside him, their towering figures casting intimidating shadows over the sand. They had mocked the human for his weakness before, but now, they saw that his strength wasn't in his body. It was in his mind, in his heart. He had something they had forgotten they once possessed, the will to fight, even against overwhelming odds. The battle began with a burst of energy, blaster fire lighting up the darkening sky. The human darted between the dunes, his movements swift and calculated, taking out enforcers with precise strikes. The goddesses, though restrained by their chains, used their height and physical prowess to knock back their attackers, overwhelming them with sheer force. They worked in tandem, the human's quick thinking and agility complementing the goddesses' raw strength. But the enforcers kept coming, wave after wave, and it became clear that their numbers were too great. The goddesses felt the weight of their chains, the loss of their once immense power hanging over them like a curse. They were warriors once, legends. Now they were reduced to this, fighting alongside a human, struggling just to survive. As the battle raged on, something cracked beneath the surface. Amid the chaos, the goddesses began to argue. They had always been proud, fierce, but the reality of their situation, their reliance on a human, was more than some of them could bear. The tallest goddess, their de facto leader, snapped at another, her voice cutting through the sound of blaster fire. "This is what we've become? Dependent on a mortal to save us?" The other goddess, panting and struggling against an enforcer, glared back. "Do you think I want this? We're powerless! We've been reduced to nothing!" The human, hearing their argument, felt a surge of frustration. He didn't have time for their bickering. They were in the middle of a battle, and every second they wasted fighting among themselves was a second closer to defeat. He darted between them, his voice sharp. "Enough! You think your power is everything, but power doesn't win wars. Unity does. You're wasting time, arguing about what you've lost instead of fighting for what you can still gain." The goddesses hesitated, their eyes narrowing at him, but there was something in his tone that struck a chord. They were warriors, yes, but they were also lost. For so long, they had defined themselves by their power, by the fear they instilled in others. And now, without that, they felt adrift, humiliated. But the human's words echoed in their minds. He was right. Their strength wasn't just in their abilities, it was in their will, their determination to rise again. Then came the revelation, one that shifted the dynamic entirely. The tallest goddess, her voice quieter now, almost pained, revealed the truth. "We weren't just captured," she said, her eyes distant. "We were betrayed. Long ago, we made a pact, an ancient agreement with forces we thought we could control. The warlord, he found a way to exploit it, to bind us in these chains. We are prisoners not only of him but of our own past mistakes." The others fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. It wasn't just the warlord who held them captive. It was their own hubris, their belief that they were untouchable. The human, though surprised by the revelation, didn't waver. If anything, it only solidified his resolve. Then it's time to break that pact, he said firmly. Not with power, but with something stronger. We fight together. You're not alone anymore. The goddesses stared at him, and for the first time, they didn't see a weak, fragile human. They saw someone who understood loss, someone who had his own battles to fight. Later, when the dust had settled and they had managed to push back the enforcers, at least for now, the goddesses turned to the human, curiosity in their eyes. They had mocked him for so long, but there was something about him that they still didn't fully understand. Why did he fight so hard? Why was he willing to risk everything for them? In the quiet moments, as they rested and tended to their wounds, the human finally shared his story. He spoke of battles fought long ago, of comrades lost, of a home he could never return to. His voice was calm, but the pain was clear in his eyes. He had lost everything once, just as they had. But where they had succumbed to bitterness and despair, he had found something else: purpose. He didn't fight for glory or power. He fought for those who couldn't. For the ones who were too weak, too broken, too lost to save themselves. And now he fought for them, the goddesses who had once been worshipped but were now in need of saving. The goddesses listened in silence, their pride slowly giving way to something else: respect. This human, this warrior with a heart of steel, wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for redemption. Not just for himself, but for them, too. It was in that moment that they made a vow, unspoken but understood. They would fight, not just for their freedom, but for their redemption. They were no longer goddesses, not in the way they once were. But they were something more now, something stronger. They had found a new kind of power, one born from their connection to this human, from their shared pain, their shared struggle. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for each other. And together, they would break their chains, not with the strength they had lost, but with the strength they had found in unity. The air was thick with tension as the human and the goddesses made their final preparations. They had come so far, enduring hardship and humiliation, but this was it, the final push. The warlord's fortress loomed on the horizon, a monolithic structure of metal and stone, its walls impenetrable to most. But they weren't most. They were a team, forged in adversity, and they had something the warlord's forces couldn't match: unity. The human stood at the center of the group, mapping out the plan. His voice was calm, measured, despite the enormity of the task ahead. He knew the fortress was heavily guarded, filled with more enforcers than they had ever faced. But he had learned, through weeks of observation and planning, the weak points in the warlord's defenses. Every patrol pattern, every gap in security, every opportunity for them to slip through. The goddesses listened carefully, their eyes focused on him. Where once they would have dismissed his words, now they understood that his mind was their greatest weapon. Still, something was stirring within the goddesses. Over the past few days, they had felt the faintest glimmers of their old power returning. It wasn't much, not compared to what they had once been, but it was enough to give them hope. Through ancient rituals, whispered in the night under the cover of darkness, they had managed to tap into a portion of their abilities. But even as their powers flickered back to life, they knew they couldn't rely on them alone. The human had shown them that victory wouldn't come from raw power, it would come from strategy, from cooperation. As they moved toward the fortress, the human's mind raced through every possible scenario. He had calculated the risks, knew where their greatest threats lay, but there was always a chance something unexpected could happen. Still, he trusted the goddesses to follow his lead. They had trained together, fought side by side. They understood that this wasn't just a battle for survival, it was a battle for redemption. When they arrived at the fortress, the warlord was waiting. His forces were prepared, their weapons gleaming, their numbers overwhelming. The human looked at the sea of enforcers before them, feeling the weight of the odds pressing down. But he didn't waver. Instead, he took a deep breath and gave the signal. The goddesses moved first, their towering figures cutting through the ranks of enforcers with precision and power. Their chains still clinked against their armor, a reminder of their captivity, but they fought with renewed purpose. The warlord, watching from above, sneered at the sight of them. He had underestimated the human and his influence on the goddesses. As they moved deeper into the fortress, it became clear that this wasn't just another rebellion, it was personal. The human strategy was unfolding exactly as planned. He knew when to strike, when to pull back, and how to maneuver around the enforcer's superior technology. The goddesses, despite their regained power, used it sparingly. They had learned from the human that brute strength wouldn't win this fight. Instead, they worked in tandem with him, following his lead, using their power strategically rather than relying on it. The fortress, once thought to be impenetrable, was slowly being torn apart from within. But the warlord wasn't done yet. With a roar, he joined the fight, his hulking form a terrifying presence on the battlefield. The human and the goddesses had anticipated this. The warlord was powerful, his weaponry advanced, but he was overconfident. He believed that his sheer strength and technological superiority would be enough to crush them. The human, now face to face with the warlord, realized that this would be the moment of truth. The goddesses circled around, but they held back, trusting him to lead the charge. The warlord taunted him, mocking the human's fragility, his smallness in comparison. But the human didn't respond to the taunts. Instead, he acted. Using the environment, the warlord's own arrogance, and the strategy he had meticulously planned, the human fought with everything he had. The goddesses joined at the perfect moment, their combined strength overwhelming the warlord's defenses. In the end, it wasn't their power that defeated him. It was their unity, their ability to work together, to follow the human's lead. The warlord fell, his fortress crumbling around him, his forces scattering in disarray. As the dust settled, the human stood among the ruins, breathing heavily. The goddesses, once so distant and proud, looked at him with a newfound respect. They had fought beside him, not as his superior, but as his equal. The warlord, the one who had enslaved them, was gone, and for the first time in what felt like centuries, they were free. The goddesses had changed. They no longer saw themselves as untouchable beings, removed from the struggles of others. Their time in chains, their reliance on the human, had taught them something far more valuable than power. They had learned humility, the strength that comes from unity, and the importance of fighting for something greater than oneself. The human, though victorious, knew his time on this planet was coming to an end. His mission was complete. But as he prepared to leave, there was a heaviness in the air. The bond between him and the goddesses, forged in battle and struggle, was not something easily broken. They stood together, silent for a moment, looking out over the vast desert that had once been their prison. The goddesses, no longer bound by chains, no longer godlike figures in their own eyes, felt a sense of peace they hadn't known before. The human had given them more than freedom. He had given them a new way to see themselves. As the human turned to leave, the tallest of the goddesses stepped forward. "You could stay," she said, her voice softer than it had ever been. There was no mockery, no disdain, only the offer of companionship. The human smiled, though there was a sadness in his eyes. "I think it's time for me to move on. But I'll always be with you." They didn't speak again, but they didn't need to. The bond between them was stronger than words. As the human walked away, disappearing into the horizon, the goddesses stood together, side by side, no longer prisoners, no longer lost. They had found their redemption, not through their powers, but through their connection to the human, to each other. And as the sun rose over the desert, they knew that they were truly free at last.